The backstage area of Lincoln Elementary School smelled like old curtains and nervous sweat. 23 students waited for their turn in the annual talent show, and most of them couldn't stop talking. Some practiced dance moves in the corner. Others tuned guitars or rehearsed comedy skits under their breath. But in the far corner, sitting on a folding chair that was too big for him, a 9-year-old boy sat completely still. His name was David, and his hands wouldn't stop shaking. He held a folder of sheet music against his chest like it was the most valuable thing in the world. In a way, it was. Those pages represented 6 months of practice. 6 months of missing recess. 6 months of choosing piano keys over playground games. 6 months of being called boring by kids who used to be his friends. Hey, look at the little guy. David's head snapped up. 3 older boys were staring at him from across the room. The tallest one, a 7th grader named Ryan, nudged his friends and pointed. "What's a 4th grader doing here?" Ryan said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Did you get lost on the way to the kiddie show?" A few students laughed. David felt his cheeks burn red, but he didn't say anything. He just held his music folder tighter. "What are you even performing?" Another boy asked, walking closer. "Let me guess. Recorder, triangle? Maybe some chopsticks on a xylophone?" More laughter. David wanted to disappear. He wanted to tell them he was playing Rachmaninoff, but he knew that would only make things worse. These kids wouldn't know who Rachmaninoff was. They'd probably just laugh harder. "Leave him alone, Ryan." A girl's voice cut through the noise. It was Jessica, an 8th grader who played violin. At least he had the guts to sign up. Ryan rolled his eyes but backed off, turning his attention to his guitar. Still, David could hear the whispers spreading through the backstage area like wildfire. "Did you see that tiny kid? What's he gonna do, sing nursery rhymes? This is gonna be awkward." David closed his eyes and tried to remember what Mrs. Peterson told him. She was his music teacher, the only person who really believed in him. Just yesterday, during their practice session in the empty music room, she'd held both his shoulders and looked him straight in the eye. "They're going to doubt you," she'd said. "People always doubt what they don't understand. But the moment you touch those keys, David, none of that will matter. Trust yourself." Easy for her to say. She wasn't the one sitting backstage while middle schoolers made fun of her. The stage manager, a parent volunteer with a clipboard, started calling out names. One by one, students headed through the black curtain to perform. David could hear the muffled sounds of the audience clapping, sometimes cheering, sometimes just politely applauding. A girl performed a pop song. The audience loved it. A group of boys did a comedy sketch. Everyone laughed. A 6th grader played electric guitar. The cheers were so loud they shook the walls. With each performance, David's stomach twisted tighter. What was he thinking? These kids were cool. They were funny and talented and confident. He was just a 9-year-old kid who spent his free time playing an instrument that most people thought was old and boring. "David Chen, you're up in 5 minutes," the stage manager called out. 5 minutes. David's hands went from shaking to completely numb. He stood up, his legs feeling like rubber bands. The sheet music slipped from his folder and scattered across the floor. "Oh, great," Ryan muttered loud enough to hear. "Kid can't even hold his music. This should be good." David dropped to his knees, scrambling to pick up the pages. His vision blurred with tears he refused to let fall. Not here. Not in front of everyone. Jessica knelt down to help him. "Hey," she said softly. "Ignore them. They're just nervous about their own performances, so they're taking it out on you." David nodded, but he didn't believe her. They weren't nervous. They were confident. They belonged here. He didn't. "What are you playing, anyway?" Jessica asked as she handed him the last page. "Rachmaninoff," David mumbled. Jessica's eyes widened. "Wait, seriously? The prelude in C-sharp minor?" David nodded. That's concert-level stuff. My violin teacher says that piece is brutal." "I know," David said quietly. For the first time that night, Jessica looked at him differently, not with pity or amusement, but with something that might have been respect. "Well then," she said, "go show them what real talent looks like." "David Chen, you're on deck," the stage manager called. David walked toward the curtain on legs that didn't feel like his own. He could hear the current performer finishing up a magic act. The audience was clapping and laughing. They were in a good mood. Maybe that would help. Or maybe it would make his inevitable failure even more embarrassing. He peeked through a gap in the curtain. The auditorium was packed. Parents sat in the middle rows. many of them already looking at their phones, probably checking how much longer until this was over. Teachers lined the back wall. Students filled the front rows, sprawled in their seats, talking to each other, barely paying attention. And there, in the center of the stage, sat the grand piano. It looked massive under the spotlight. Shiny and black and professional, David had practiced on it exactly twice. The school usually kept it locked, only bringing it out for special occasions. He'd spent the last 6 months practicing on his grandmother's old upright piano that was missing 2 keys and had 5 more that didn't work. Right, this piano would be different, better, but also more intimidating. Ladies and gentlemen, the principal's voice boomed through the microphone. Our next performer is a 4th grader making his talent show debut. Please welcome David Chen on piano. The applause was polite, scattered, obligatory. David pushed through the curtain and stepped into the spotlight. The heat from the stage lights hit him immediately, making him squint. He couldn't see the audience clearly anymore, just dark shapes and seats. A sea of faces that were probably all wondering what this little kid was doing on stage. He walked toward the piano, and every step felt like it took an hour. His worn sneakers squeaked against the stage floor, and he heard a few giggles from the student section. Someone whispered something. More giggles followed. The piano bench was too low. Of course it was. Everything was built for adults, for real musicians, not for a 9-year-old boy who probably had no business being here in the first place. David adjusted the bench, turning the knob to raise it higher. It squeaked loudly, echoing through the microphone system. More giggles. Someone in the back made a comment he couldn't quite hear, but the tone was clear enough. They were laughing at him. He adjusted the bench again. Still not quite right. His feet barely touched the pedals. He adjusted it one more time, and this time the squeak was even louder. Now there was outright laughter from the student section. David wanted to run, wanted to jump off this stage and disappear forever. But then he thought about his grandmother's house, about that first day he'd touched her piano, how that single note had felt like magic. He thought about Mrs. Peterson, who'd given up her lunch breaks for 6 months to teach him. He thought about all those hours of practice, his fingers aching, his back sore, but pushing through because the music mattered more than the pain. He settled onto the bench and placed his hands on the keys. They felt cool and smooth under his fingertips. Real ivory, not like the plastic keys at his grandmother's house. The auditorium was still buzzing with whispered conversations. Most people weren't even paying attention. They were waiting for this awkward moment to pass so they could get to the next performance. David took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and began to play. 18 months earlier, David had no idea what a piano even sounded like up close. It was a regular Saturday afternoon. His parents had taken him to visit his grandmother like they did every other weekend. Usually these visits were boring. His grandmother would make tea, his parents would talk about adult stuff, and David would sit on the couch counting ceiling tiles or watching old game shows on her ancient television. But that particular Saturday, his grandmother's phone rang. She went into the kitchen to answer it, and his parents followed her to say hello to whoever was calling. David was left alone in the living room with nothing to do. That's when he noticed it. Against the far wall, covered with a dusty white sheet, was something large and rectangular. David had seen it 100 times before, but never really paid attention to it. He'd always assumed it was just furniture or boxes or something equally boring. But that day, curiosity got the better of him. He walked over and lifted the corner of the sheet. Dust particles floated up into the afternoon sunlight streaming through the window. And there it was, a piano, old wooden with yellowed keys and scratches across its surface. It looked like something from another time, like it belonged in an old movie. David looked back toward the kitchen. His parents were still talking. He could hear his grandmother laughing about something. He pressed one key. The sound that came out wasn't what he expected. It was clear and bright and somehow sad all at the same time. It hung in the air for a moment, then slowly faded away. David stood there, frozen, feeling something he'd never felt before. It was like that single note had opened a door in his chest he didn't know existed. He pressed another key, then another. They were out of tune and some didn't work right, but David didn't care. Each sound was different. Each one made him feel something new. "I see you found my old friend," a voice said behind him. David spun around, expecting to be in trouble, but his grandmother was smiling. She walked over and sat on the piano bench, patting the space beside her. "I used to play this every day," she said, running her wrinkled fingers across the keys, "before your grandfather got sick. Before these hands got too stiff. Can you teach me?" David asked before he could stop himself. His grandmother looked at him with surprise. Then her eyes got watery in that way old people's eyes do when they're happy and sad at the same time. "I'd like that very much," she said. That's how it started. Every Saturday, while his parents drank tea and talked about bills and work and boring grown-up things, David sat at his grandmother's piano learning notes and chords and simple songs. At first, it was just "Mary Had a Little Lamb" and "Hot Cross Buns," baby stuff. But David practiced at home too, using a paper keyboard his grandmother drew for him. He'd sit on his bed pressing the paper keys, humming the notes, imagining he was making real music. After 2 months, his grandmother taught him a real song. Something called Für Elise by someone named Beethoven. It took David 3 weeks to learn just the first part. But when he finally played it all the way through, his grandmother cried. "You have a gift," she told him. "A real gift. You need proper lessons. But proper lessons cost money." David's parents worked hard, but there wasn't extra money for things like music lessons. His dad worked double shifts at the warehouse. His mom cleaned houses 6 days a week. They could barely afford his school supplies. When David started 4th grade that fall, he thought his piano dreams were over. His grandmother's piano had finally broken completely. 3 strings had snapped and she couldn't afford to fix it. David went back to his paper keyboard, but it wasn't the same. Then one day in music class, something changed. Mrs. Peterson, the music teacher, was teaching them about different instruments. She asked if anyone could name a famous composer. David's hand shot up. "Beethoven," he said. "He wrote for Elise and the Moonlight Sonata and Symphony No. 5. Mrs. Peterson looked surprised. Most 4th graders could barely name one composer. "You know about classical music?" she asked. "My grandmother taught me," David said. "I used to play her piano." After class, Mrs. Peterson asked David to stay behind. She led him to the piano in the corner of the music room. It was old and beat up, nothing fancy, but it worked. "Play something for me," she said. David's hands were shaking. He hadn't touched a real piano in 3 months. But he sat down and played what he remembered of Für Elise. He messed up twice and had to start over once. But he made it through. When he finished, Mrs. Peterson was quiet for a long moment. "David," she finally said, "how would you feel about learning more? I could teach you during lunch. No charge, I can't let talent like this go to waste." David couldn't believe it. "Really, you'd do that?" "On one condition," Mrs. Peterson said. "You have to promise me you'll practice. Real practice. Not just when you feel like it. Every single day." "I promise," David said, and he meant it. That's when everything changed. But not in the way David expected. The next day at lunch, while all his friends went to the cafeteria and then outside to play soccer, David went to the music room. And the day after that, and the day after that. At first his friends thought it was just a one-time thing, but after a week they started asking questions. "Why don't you ever play with us anymore?" his friend Tommy asked. "I have piano practice," David explained. Tommy laughed. "Piano? That's for girls and old people." "No, it's not," David said. But Tommy was already walking away. By the second week, the invitations stopped coming. Nobody asked David to play soccer anymore. Nobody saved him a seat at lunch. When he walked past his old friends in the hallway, they'd whisper and laugh. "There goes Piano Boy," someone said one day. The nickname stuck. David tried not to care. He focused on the music. Mrs. Peterson was teaching him pieces he'd only dreamed of playing. Mozart, Chopin. And then, 3 months ago, she'd introduced him to Rachmaninoff. The prelude in C-sharp minor was the hardest piece David had ever seen. The sheet music looked like chaos, with notes stacked on top of each other, complicated rhythms, huge jumps across the keyboard. Mrs. Peterson said it was too advanced for him. "Let me try," David begged. She let him try. It took him 2 weeks just to learn the first page. His hands cramped. His fingers got sore. He made mistakes constantly. But slowly, painfully, he started to figure it out. Mrs. Peterson couldn't believe it. "David, most adults can't play this piece. You're 9 years old. Does that mean I can't do it?" David asked. "No," she said, smiling. "It means you're extraordinary, but extraordinary doesn't come easy. You ready to work harder than you've ever worked?" David nodded. For the next 3 months, he practiced that piece until he could play it in his sleep. His hands memorized every chord, every transition, every dramatic moment. He practiced so much that his mom got worried. "You need to play with other kids," she said. "Make friends. Be normal," but David didn't feel normal. He felt like he'd found something most people spend their whole lives searching for. A purpose. A passion. Something that made sense when nothing else did. When Mrs. Peterson told him about the talent show, David wasn't sure. Getting on stage in front of everyone who called him Piano Boy, everyone who'd stopped being his friend, that sounded terrifying. "This is your chance," Mrs. Peterson said. "Your chance to show them what real dedication looks like. What real music sounds like." So David signed up, and now here he was sitting at a piano on stage, with hundreds of people waiting for him to either impress them or embarrass himself. He took one more deep breath, feeling the weight of every hour he'd practiced, every lunch period he'd missed, every friend he'd lost. Then he began to play. The first 3 notes came out like thunder, deep, powerful, commanding. They echoed through the auditorium with a force that seemed impossible from a 9-year-old boy sitting at a piano that was almost bigger than he was. The conversations in the audience stopped mid-sentence. Phones were lowered. Heads turned toward the stage. David didn't notice. His eyes were closed, and he was somewhere else entirely, somewhere that existed only in the music. His small hands moved across the keys with absolute certainty, stretching to reach chords that should have been impossible for fingers his size. The opening section of Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor is unforgiving. It demands power and precision at the same time. It requires the pianist to make the instrument sing and roar and whisper, sometimes all within the same measure. Professional pianists spend years mastering it. David played it like he'd been born knowing how. In the front row, a group of 5th graders who'd been slouching in their seats sat up straight. Their mouths hung open slightly. One of them elbowed his friend, but neither of them looked away from the stage. The melody shifted, becoming quieter, more mysterious. David's right hand danced over the higher keys while his left hand provided a steady, haunting bass line. His whole body moved with the music, leaning into the dramatic moments, pulling back during the softer passages. Mrs. Peterson stood in the wings, one hand pressed against her mouth. She'd heard David play this piece dozens of times during practice, but this was different. The school piano was better than the old one in the music room, and David was playing with an emotion she'd never heard from him before. He wasn't just performing the notes. He was living inside them. A parent in the 3rd row nudged his wife and whispered, "Is that really a kid playing?" His wife didn't answer. She couldn't. She was too busy watching the impossible unfold in front of her. The piece built in intensity. David's hands flew across the keyboard, his fingers moving so fast they blurred. The music swelled and crashed like ocean waves, each chord more powerful than the last. And through it all, not a single note was out of place. Not a single rhythm was off. It was perfect. In the backstage area, Ryan stopped tuning his guitar. He'd been getting ready for his own performance, trying not to think about the little kid who'd gone before him. But the music coming from the stage made him forget all about his jokes and his mockery from earlier. "Is that really the same kid?" he asked Jessica, who was standing next to him. Jessica just nodded, her eyes wide. "I told you. That's Rachmaninoff. That's not kid stuff." On stage, David reached the middle section of the piece. This was the part that had given him the most trouble during practice. The part where Mrs. Peterson had to break down every single note, every single timing, until his hands understood the complicated rhythms. He'd played it wrong so many times that he'd almost given up. But his hands remembered. They knew exactly where to go, exactly how hard to press, exactly when to hold and when to release. The principal, standing at the back of the auditorium, had been checking his watch every few minutes. He had a dozen more performances to get through, and he was already thinking about how late this was running. But now, he stood completely still, his watch forgotten. In 20 years of running talent shows, he'd never heard anything like this. The music shifted again, becoming gentler, almost fragile. This was David's favorite part, the part that reminded him of his grandmother, of those first Saturday afternoons in her living room, of the way her eyes would get soft when she talked about the music she used to play. He thought about her sitting in the audience right now, in the 4th row. She'd worn her best dress for this. She'd told everyone at her senior center that her grandson was performing. David wondered if she was crying. She always cried when he played. The gentle section ended, and the music exploded back to life. This was the final push, the climax of the piece. David's hands pounded the keys with controlled fury, his arms working like pistons, his whole body engaged in creating sound that filled every corner of the auditorium. A teacher in the back row felt goosebumps rise on her arms. She taught English, not music, but she understood enough to know she was witnessing something special, something rare. The student section had gone completely quiet. Even the 8th graders, who usually couldn't care less about the talent show, were leaning forward in their seats. Some of them had their phones out, recording. Others just stared, trying to understand how someone 3 years younger than them could do something they couldn't even imagine doing. Tommy, David's old friend from soccer, sat in the middle of the student section. He watched David's hands flying across the keys and felt something weird in his chest, guilt maybe, or shame. He remembered calling piano old people stuff. He remembered laughing when other kids called David piano boy. He remembered stopping invitations to play soccer, stopping conversations in the hallway, all because David had chosen to do something difficult, something meaningful. The music raced toward its conclusion. David's hands moved with impossible speed and precision, hitting every note exactly right, building tension with each passing second. The entire auditorium held its breath, and then, in one final explosive moment, David brought his hands down on the keys for the last chord. The sound rang out clear and powerful and final. David lifted his hands away from the piano and let the note fade into silence. Only then did he open his eyes. Only then did he remember where he was. For 3 long seconds, nothing happened. The auditorium was so quiet you could hear the heating system humming in the walls. David sat frozen on the piano bench, his heart pounding, suddenly terrified. Had he messed up? Had people hated it? Was the silence because everyone was too uncomfortable to clap? He started to stand up, ready to run off stage as fast as possible. Then the silence shattered. It started with one person in the back row. A single pair of hands clapping. Then another person joined in. Then another. Then suddenly everyone was standing up, the entire auditorium rising to their feet as one, and the applause crashed over David like a tidal wave. It wasn't polite applause. It wasn't the kind of clapping people do because they're supposed to. This was real. This was thunderous. This was the kind of ovation that shook the walls and made the stage lights rattle in their fixtures. David stood there stunned, unable to process what was happening. People were cheering. Actually cheering. Some were whistling. Others were calling out bravo, like they did at real concerts. His grandmother was on her feet in the 4th row, tears streaming down her face, clapping so hard her hands must have hurt. His parents stood next to her, both of them crying too, his dad's arm around his mom's shoulders. Mrs. Peterson rushed onto the stage and pulled David into a hug. "You did it," she whispered in his ear. "You showed them." The applause continued. 30 seconds, 45 seconds, a full minute of standing ovation for a 9-year-old boy who'd been mocked just 15 minutes earlier. In the front row, the 5th graders who'd been giggling at his squeaky shoes were now clapping harder than anyone. In the middle section, Tommy clapped until his palms stung, wishing he could take back every mean word he'd ever said. And backstage, Ryan set down his guitar and just shook his head in disbelief. David finally managed to wave awkwardly at the audience, his face red, his eyes wide. He walked off stage on legs that felt like jelly, and as he stepped through the curtain, everything changed. The other performers who'd been sitting around looking bored or nervous were now standing, forming a path for him. And as he walked through them, they started clapping too. Jessica grabbed his arm. That was incredible. Like actually incredible. Other students gathered around, all talking at once. "How long have you been playing? Can you teach me? Will you perform at our spring concert?" That was the coolest thing I've ever seen. David couldn't find words. His brain had stopped working somewhere between the final chord and the moment everyone stood up. He just nodded and smiled and tried not to cry. Ryan pushed through the small crowd. David tensed, expecting another insult, another joke at his expense. But Ryan just held out his hand. "That was unreal, man. Seriously. I've been playing guitar for 4 years and I can't do anything close to that." David shook his hand, still not quite believing any of this was real. The stage manager had to practically push the next performer onto stage because everyone backstage was too busy crowding around David to pay attention to the show. And in that moment, standing in the dusty backstage area of his elementary school, surrounded by people who 15 minutes ago thought he was just a weird little kid who played piano, David finally understood what Mrs. Peterson had been trying to tell him all along. The music had spoken louder than any words ever could. David couldn't sleep that night. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the performance over and over in his mind. The way the piano had felt under his fingers, the silence after the final chord, the explosion of applause that followed. It all felt like a dream, like something that had happened to someone else. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. Again. It had been buzzing all evening. He picked it up and scrolled through the messages. 23 new texts, most from kids at school he'd barely spoken to in months. That was amazing tonight. Dude, you're like a genius or something. Can you teach me piano? Sorry I was mean before. That was really cool. That last one was from Tommy. David stared at it for a long time. Part of him wanted to feel angry. Tommy had led the charge in calling him Piano Boy. Tommy had been the first one to stop inviting him to play soccer. Tommy had made lunch periods lonely for 6 straight months, but another part of him, the bigger part, just felt tired. Tired of being angry. Tired of being the kid everyone avoided. He typed back, "Thanks. Maybe we can hang out sometime." 3 dots appeared immediately. Tommy was typing back, "Yeah, that would be cool." Really cool. David set down his phone and closed his eyes. Tomorrow would be interesting. He had no idea how interesting it would actually be. When David walked into school the next morning, he noticed something was different. Kids were staring at him, but not the way they used to stare when they called him Piano Boy. This was different. This was curious. Impressed, even. "Hey, that's the kid from last night," he heard someone whisper as he walked past. He made it halfway to his classroom when a woman he'd never seen before approached him in the hallway. She was dressed professionally, carrying a leather bag, and she smiled at him like they were old friends. "David?"
"David Chen?"
she asked. "Yes," David said nervously. Was he in trouble? Had he done something wrong? "My name is Catherine Wells. I'm the director of the Riverside Music Academy." She handed him a business card. "I was at the talent show last night. I'd love to talk to you and your parents about something." Before David could respond, she was gone, heading toward the principal's office. David looked down at the card in his hand. The Riverside Music Academy. He'd heard of it. It was where rich kids went to learn music from professional instructors, the kind of place that cost more per month than his parents made in a week. What was that about? Tommy appeared next to him, looking at the business card. "I don't know," David said honestly. At lunch, instead of going to the music room for practice like he usually did, David found himself surrounded by people in the cafeteria. Kids who'd never talked to him before wanted to sit at his table. They asked him questions about piano, about how long he'd been playing, about whether it was hard to learn. Jessica, the 8th grader who'd helped him backstage, sat down across from him. "You know your video is everywhere, right?" "What video?" David asked. She pulled out her phone and showed him. Someone had recorded his entire performance and posted it online. It already had thousands of views, hundreds of comments. "This kid is insane. 9 years old and playing Rachmaninoff? No way. I'm a piano teacher and I can't even play this piece. Who is this child prodigy?" David felt dizzy. He'd never been on the internet before. His parents barely let him watch videos online. And now thousands of strangers had watched him play. "Is that okay?" he asked nervously. "Am I allowed to be on there?" Jessica shrugged. "It was a public performance. I think it's fine. But dude, you're kind of famous now." Famous felt like the wrong word. Famous was for movie stars and athletes and people who did things that actually mattered. David just played piano. He'd just done what he loved doing. But over the next few days, he started to understand what Jessica meant. The video kept spreading. By Wednesday, it had 50,000 views. By Friday, it was over 200,000. News websites started picking it up. "9-year-old stuns audience with Rachmaninoff performance," one headline read. Another said, "The piano prodigy you need to hear." David's parents got calls from local news stations wanting to interview him. The principal asked if David would perform at the district-wide assembly. Complete strangers recognized him at the grocery store. "You're that piano kid," a woman said in the cereal aisle, pulling out her phone to take a picture. It was overwhelming and exciting and terrifying all at once, but the most important thing happened 2 weeks after the talent show. David and his parents sat in a conference room at the Riverside Music Academy. The walls were covered with photos of students performing in concert halls. holding trophies, standing with famous musicians. Everything about the place screamed expensive and professional and way out of their league. Catherine Wells sat across from them, smiling warmly. Next to her was an older man with silver hair and kind eyes. He was wearing a suit that probably cost more than David's family's car. "This is Robert Harrison," Catherine said. "He's one of our senior instructors. He's performed at Carnegie Hall, taught at Juilliard, and worked with some of the finest young musicians in the country." Robert looked at David. "I watched your video. Then I watched it 12 more times. Then I came to see you play in person at your school assembly last week." He leaned forward. "David, you have something very rare. Something that can't be taught. You have musicality, soul, whatever you want to call it, you've got it." David's mom reached over and squeezed his hand. She was trying not to cry. His dad sat perfectly still, the way he always did when he was nervous. "We'd like to offer David a full scholarship," Catherine said. "Lessons 3 times a week with Robert. Access to our practice rooms and our concert grand pianos. Performance opportunities. Everything he needs to develop his talent properly." David's dad cleared his throat. "We can't afford full scholarship," Catherine repeated. "No cost to you at all. We have donors who specifically fund talented students who show exceptional promise. David qualifies." The room went quiet. David looked at his parents. His mom was definitely crying now. His dad's eyes were getting red around the edges. "There's one more thing," Robert said. He pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. "In 3 months, we're hosting a student showcase. Professional musicians, music school scouts, donors. It's a big deal. I'd like David to perform." "Okay," David said before he could think about it. Robert smiled. "Just okay? Not nervous?" "I'm always nervous," David admitted. "But I'm more excited than nervous now." His parents signed the papers that day. David started lessons the following week. Everything changed after that. Not just the piano lessons, though those were incredible. Robert pushed him harder than Mrs. Peterson ever had, introducing him to pieces that seemed impossible at first. But more than that, the way people treated him changed. Kids at school didn't call him Piano Boy anymore. They called him by his name. They invited him to birthday parties and weekend hangouts. Tommy started eating lunch with him again, and they talked about normal stuff like video games and movies, not just piano. But the best part came a month after everything started. David was practicing in one of the academy's small rehearsal rooms. The piano was beautiful, a baby grand that responded to every touch. He was working through a particularly difficult section of a Chopin nocturne when he heard a knock on the door. Mrs. Peterson stood there, smiling. "Mrs. Peterson, what are you doing here?" David jumped up from the bench. "Catherine called me," she said, walking into the room. "Wanted to know about your practice habits, your work ethic, your progress over the past year." She sat down on the bench and patted the spot next to her, just like his grandmother used to do. "I told her you were the most dedicated student I'd ever taught, that you sacrificed everything for this, that you deserved every opportunity coming your way." "I couldn't have done it without you," David said quietly. "You gave up your lunch breaks for me. You believed in me when nobody else did." Mrs. Peterson's eyes got watery. "David, teaching you was never a sacrifice. It was a privilege. Do you know how rare it is to meet someone who loves something as much as you love music? Most people spend their whole lives looking for that." They sat there for a moment in comfortable silence. "I have something for you," Mrs. Peterson said, pulling a book from her bag. It was old and worn with a brown leather cover. "This is every piano piece I think you should learn over the next 2 years. Some easy, some impossible. I've been making notes in here for weeks." David opened the book and saw her handwriting covering the margins. Little tips, reminders, encouragement written next to each piece. "This is too much," he said. "It's not enough," she replied. "You're going to do amazing things, David. I want to make sure I helped you get there, even in some small way." David hugged her. Not a quick kid hug, but a real one. The kind that says thank you for everything, for believing in me, for changing my life. When she left, David sat back at the piano. He opened the book to the first piece she'd marked. Debussy. Clair de Lune. One of the most beautiful pieces ever written. He placed his hands on the keys and began to play. Outside the practice room, other students walked past. Some stopped to listen. Others kept going, used to hearing good music in a place like this, but David didn't notice any of them. He was lost in the music where he belonged, where he was most himself. where everything made sense. 3 months felt like both forever and no time at all. David practiced every day after school at the academy, sometimes for 2 hours, sometimes for 3. Robert was a tough teacher, but fair. He pushed David to think about music differently, to feel the emotion behind every note, to understand the story each composer was trying to tell. "You have the technical skill," Robert told him one afternoon. "Now you need to find your own voice in the music. Don't just play what's on the page. Play what's in your heart." At first, David didn't understand. He was playing the notes correctly. What else was there? But slowly, over weeks of practice, he started to get it. Music wasn't just about pressing the right keys at the right time. It was about communication, about sharing something true and real with whoever was listening. The showcase was scheduled for the last Saturday in April. David would be performing Debussy's Clair de Lune and a Chopin waltz, 2 pieces that were completely different from the Rachmaninoff that had made him famous. Robert said it was important to show range, to prove he wasn't just a one-performance wonder. The week before the showcase, David started getting nervous again. The butterflies in his stomach that had gone away after the talent show came rushing back. "What if I mess up?" he asked Robert during their lesson on Wednesday. "Then you mess up," Robert said simply. "It happens to everyone. Even the greatest pianists in the world make mistakes. But everyone's expecting me to be perfect now. Because of the video. Because of everything." Robert stopped what he was doing and turned to face David completely. "Listen to me carefully. You don't owe anyone perfection. You don't owe anyone anything except honesty. Get on that stage and play honestly. Play like you played at your school. Not for applause, not for recognition, but because the music matters to you. That's all anyone can ask." David nodded, but he wasn't sure he believed it. The day of the showcase arrived with sunny skies and warm weather. David's whole family came. His parents, his grandmother, even his aunt and uncle who lived 2 hours away. Mrs. Peterson was there too, sitting with his family in the 3rd row. But this wasn't like his school's auditorium. This was a real concert hall with velvet seats and crystal chandeliers and acoustics designed specifically for music. Important-looking people in expensive clothes filled the seats. David recognized a few faces from the news and from classical music albums. Backstage, there were 15 other students performing. All of them were older than David. Most were in high school. A few were in college. They all looked confident and professional, warming up with complicated scales and arpeggios. David found a quiet corner and tried to breathe normally. A girl about 16 years old sat down next to him. "First time performing here?" she asked. David nodded. "Yeah, it's intimidating," she said. "I threw up before my first showcase last year." "That's not making me feel better," David said. She laughed. "Sorry. What I meant to say is that you get used to it. And hey, I saw your video. You're the Rachmaninoff kid, right? If you can handle that, you can handle anything." "That felt different," David said. "That was at my school. Everyone there knew me. This is scarier because they're strangers," the girl finished. "I get it. But strangers are easier in some ways. They don't have any expectations except good music. They're not worried about whether you're cool or popular or whatever. They just want to hear you play." David thought about that. It helped a little. The showcase started at 7. David was scheduled to perform 7th right after intermission. He sat in the wings and watched the other performers. They were all good. Really good. A violinist played something fast and technical that David couldn't even follow. A cellist played something so sad it made the audience cry. A 17-year-old pianist performed Liszt with the kind of confidence David couldn't imagine having. By the time intermission came, David was convinced he shouldn't be there. These were serious musicians, real musicians. He was just a 9-year-old kid who'd gotten lucky with one good performance. "You're up next," the stage manager told him as intermission ended. David walked to the piano on legs that felt like they might give out. The stage was huge, much bigger than his school's. The piano was enormous, a full concert grand that gleamed under the lights. He sat down and adjusted the bench, grateful that this time it didn't squeak. The audience settled into their seats. David could see his grandmother in the 3rd row, wearing the same dress she'd worn to his talent show. She waved at him, a small movement that probably broke concert etiquette but made David smile anyway. Robert stood in the wings, giving him an encouraging nod. David placed his hands on the keys and closed his eyes. He thought about the first time he'd touched his grandmother's piano. He thought about all those lunch periods practicing with Mrs. Peterson. He thought about what Robert had said. Play honestly. He began Claire de Lune. The piece started softly, almost like a whisper. David's fingers moved gently across the keys, coaxing out the delicate melody. This wasn't like Rachmaninoff. This wasn't about power or showing off technical skill. This was about beauty, about capturing the feeling of moonlight on water, of quiet moments, of peace. The audience faded away. The concert hall faded away. It was just David and the piano and the music. He thought about his grandmother while he played, about how she used to play this piano before her hands got old and stiff, about how she'd given him this gift without even meaning to. The music swelled with emotion, not because David was trying to be emotional, but because he genuinely felt it. The middle section became more urgent, more passionate. David's hands moved faster, the melody building and climbing. But even in the passionate moments, there was still that underlying gentleness, that sense of something beautiful and fragile. As he moved into the final section, bringing the piece back to its quiet beginning, David felt something click into place. This was why he loved piano. Not for the applause or the recognition or even for proving people wrong. He loved it because when he played, he could say things he didn't have words for. He could share feelings that were too big or too complicated to explain. The final notes drifted into silence. David held his hands over the keys for a moment, not wanting to break the spell. Then the applause came. Warm and appreciative and real. David opened his eyes and stood up to bow. His hands were shaking, but this time from relief and happiness rather than fear. He played the Chopin waltz next, something lighter and more playful. By then his nerves were gone. He was just playing, enjoying the music, sharing something he loved with people who wanted to listen. When he finished and walked off stage, Robert was waiting with a huge smile. That was honest, he said. That was real. That was exactly what music should be. After the showcase, people crowded around David and his family. Music school representatives handed his parents business cards. Other instructors complimented his technique. A journalist asked if she could write a story about him. But the moment David would remember most came later after everyone had left. When it was just his family and Mrs. Peterson walking to their cars in the parking lot. His grandmother took his hand. "Your grandfather would have loved to hear you play tonight," she said softly. "He always said music was the language of the soul. I never really understood what he meant until I heard you." David squeezed her hand. "What's next?" his dad asked. "More showcases? Competitions?" "I don't know," David said honestly. "I just want to keep learning. Keep getting better. Keep playing." Mrs. Peterson smiled. "That's the right answer. Don't let anyone pressure you into being something you're not ready to be. You're 9 years old. You have time." Tommy texted him later that night. "Saw the video from tonight. You crushed it. Want to hang out tomorrow? Maybe I could hear you play something in person. If that's okay." David smiled at his phone and typed back, "Yeah, that sounds good. And Tommy, thanks for being my friend again. Thanks for being patient with me." Tommy replied, "I was kind of a jerk, kind of." David wrote back with a laughing emoji. "Okay, definitely a jerk, but I'm working on it." David set down his phone and looked at his hands, the same hands that had pressed a single key on his grandmother's piano 18 months ago. They looked different now, stronger, more capable, but also the same. Still small, still a kid's hands. He thought about everything that had happened since that first note. The loneliness, the practice, the mockery, the moment on stage when everything changed, the opportunities that followed, the friendships that were rebuilt, the new ones that were formed. Piano had never been child's play. It had been hard work and sacrifice and dedication. It had cost him friends and recess and normal kid stuff, but it had also given him purpose, identity, a way to express himself that felt more true than words ever could. It had taught him that being different wasn't something to apologize for. That passion was worth protecting, even when people didn't understand it. And most importantly, it had taught him that sometimes the things worth doing are the things that seem impossible. The things people say you're too young for or too small for or too whatever for. Sometimes you just have to sit down at the piano and prove them wrong, not for them, for yourself, because at the end of the day, that's what really matters. Not the applause or the views or the recognition, but the moment when you're alone with something you love, doing it simply because it makes you feel alive. That's when you know you found something real. That's when you know you're exactly where you're supposed to be.